Food is the moral right of all who are born into this world, said the eminent agronomist Norman Borlaug, a sentiment that encapsulates the heart of our discussion today. I'm happy to bring you a truly special episode on Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, the father of India's Green Revolution. As we navigate this conversation, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, a person uniquely positioned to provide us with a glimpse into the personal facets of Dr. Swaminathan's incredible journey. She's the daughter of Dr. M.S. Swaminathan. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan is a pediatrician, and she has also served as the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. We could actually talk so much about her work, but today she's joining us to talk about her father's legacy. Good evening, Dr. Swaminathan. The theme of this podcast is to cover events and personalities from the history of science, people who bridged science and humanity. I immediately thought of Dr. M.S. Swaminathan and his role in ensuring self-reliance and sustainability, when it comes to food and agriculture in India. So to start off, can you share some of your, early memories or stories that reflect your father's dedication to his work in agriculture in India?
So my earliest memories of growing up as a child on the campus of the Indian Agricultural Research Institute, or the PUSA Institute as we called it in New Delhi, was basically to see my father take off very early in the morning every day on his bicycle with his files in the back basket of his cycle. And he would first go to the fields to see the experiments that were going on there. And then he would find his way to the Department of Botany and then later the Department of Genetics. And he would come back in the evening, and very often he would be accompanied by or followed soon by a group of students, mostly masters and PhD students, who would come in to discuss their work. And that would go on for a couple of more hours. And then we would all have our dinner together and, could spend a little bit of time, and he would tell us some stories or about what he was doing. And so I remember very long days he had. And sometimes we would accompany him, like on the weekends when he went to visit the farmers' villages. And this was all during the time in the 60s, where the new varieties of wheat and rice were being tested, these dwarf varieties that were also very high yielding. So we would often go into the villages around Delhi, mostly in Haryana, sometimes Punjab. And we would love that because we could spend the day running around in the fields while my father was actually doing work, talking to farmers and getting their feedback and inputs. So those are actually, it's a lovely childhood if you really look back, because it was very carefree, it was very safe and secure within that campus. We had a lot of friends, and we had all these students, masters and PhD students, who spoiled us, who took us for rides on their bicycles, took us to the circus or the park or somewhere, played Holi with us, Christmas. We celebrated every festival, and my mother made it a point particularly to make sure that the foreign students on the campus felt at home.
Well, thank you. Actually, I mean, in my research, I also, did come across some anecdotes where, being a scientist, right, he never shied away from actually going down to the fields and having those one-on-one conversations with farmers, and how he was such a, passionate educator. So thank you, thank you for sharing that. And from your perspective, right, looking back, what do you believe are the most significant impacts of your father's contribution to agriculture and the Green Revolution in India?
So I think the fact that he was able to identify very early on the potential that these shorter varieties of wheat might have at the time when clearly famine and hunger were chronic problems in India, and he had just trained and finished his PhD and postdoc and come back. And remember, this was in the early 50s or mid 50s when communication wasn't like it is today. And yet he had picked up by reading the scientific literature, he knew of experiments that were happening in Mexico. Dr. Norman Borlaug was working, and also in the US in a couple of labs. And then he reached out and to find out more about, whether it was possible to collaborate and so on. So I think the first is that he recognized very early the potential and how that might actually be a solution for the need that India had at that time. The second is that he was able to convince and work with administrators and policymakers to get approval for importing, several thousand tons of seeds, which was quite a big deal in those days because it was a lot of foreign exchange in the post-independence era. And there were many people who were very opposed to the idea that, to do this experiment without really knowing what was going to come of it. But he was able to convince the decision makers, and particularly the finance secretary and finance minister, to go ahead and approve that massive purchase of seeds. And the third is, as you just said, his ability to work with the key stakeholders in all of this. And those are the farmers, in this case in North India, Punjab, Haryana, Western Pradesh, where he was able to convince them to try these new seeds and see for themselves, if they liked what they saw. And of course, after the first couple of seasons, the word spread, and there was a massive, huge demand for these new seeds. In fact, he still preserved the letters that he got from the different farmers groups, the Kisan Sanghs across North India, writing and requesting him arrange for, X number of tons of seeds. So I think that those three things that he was able to do, which is, I think, very rare for one individual, particularly a scientist, to be able to do. And I think that was really responsible for moving ahead so rapidly and, for the unfolding of the Green Revolution.
It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, his, passion in just going down and trying to persuade those farmers personally, because I know that we were importers of grains, before the Green Revolution. Right. And then flipped on its head, and we became exporters of grains. So, yes. Tremendous impact of the work. Now, as far as do you recall any challenges or obstacles that Dr. Swaminathan faced in his journey?
Oh yeah, plenty. We were children then, so we didn't fully understand all of the details. But, I think when you're trying to do something very bold and big, you're bound to face opposition. So that, I think, was to be expected, and he was able to overcome that. But also a lot of jealousy, and this happens a lot when, if you are successful and obviously you get a lot of attention, maybe he did win a lot of awards and things like that. So I'm sure that he had a lot of people with professional jealousy as well, and who would sometimes try to create some, trouble by getting journalists to write articles. And there was one particularly orchestrated attack on his work. I think this was probably in the 70s, alleging that that the whole Green Revolution thing was bad, for India and bad for the environment and so on. And, he had always been the first one to recognize the fact that the Green Revolution was a particular need, it was a solution to a particular need, and that it did employ, apart from the high-yielding seeds, of course, the application of pesticide, fertilizer, and the provision of water. And so it was all of those things together that made the yield go up so much. But he had, in the late 60s, himself articulated that this was not a sustainable solution, that one would have to review and change course at some point, because otherwise the water and the groundwater and the soil and everything would be overexploited and depleted of nutrients, and that there would be too many chemicals, in the soil. So I think I remember, I must have been in my early teens then when this attack on him played out. There was a lot of media attention to it. But, he handled it in his usual way. He was never outwardly, never showed his anger or displeasure or anything like that. And I think he just made a case out for the science, and pros and cons of everything that had happened. And he was always very open to new ideas and also to criticism. So I think that sort of held him in good stead because he never got defensive. He was always open to criticism and willing to consider the other viewpoint.
Again, in my research, I came across that he authored a book called In Search of Biohappiness. And, he was, in fact, promoting organic farming, adopting traditional farming methods, and so on. And so now, were there any, key milestones or triumphs that brought him a sense of fulfillment, in this whole journey? Because it must have been quite a long journey, right? You see farmers, planting those seeds, but that doesn't mean anything, right? It takes a lot of time. But at which point did he find that sense of fulfillment?
Well, he must have had several moments like that in his long, professional life and career. That I think that the second half of the 60s and the early 70s was when there was all of this action happening. And within a couple of years, actually, it was clear that India would not face the same kind of food insecurity that it did in the past. And, the imports could be done away with, and there was enough food to feed the population at that time. I'm sure that was extremely satisfying and fulfilling. But I think he also got a lot of satisfaction out of building the agricultural research capacity, first in India, as when he became the Director General of the Indian Council of Agricultural Research. He set up the Indian Agricultural Research Service. He set up what he called the Lab to Land program through the Krishi Vigyan Kendras, which were basically the outreach and extension workers, who were taking the scientific and technological advances and developments that were happening in the ICAR labs to the farmers through these Krishi Vigyan Kendras. And he set up many, many institutes of the ICAR to address specific areas in agriculture, but also in fisheries, in forestry, in horticulture, in livestock, in dairy, etc. He, at the same time, was involved in a lot of international institution building. He was involved with the CGIAR system. He was one of the key people who brought the ICRISAT to Hyderabad in India, but he was also very closely involved with setting up of some of the other CGIAR institutes. And he was involved with the World Wildlife Fund. He was the president of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, that he chaired for 6 years, and many other such affiliations and responsibilities that he took on. So essentially, it was an institution builder. A lot of that was in India. Then, as Director General of the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, he did the same thing for Southeast Asia in terms of building agricultural research capacity, particularly in countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, China, which had been sort of cut off. And of course, some of these countries had just been through war, and their whole population of scientists had been decimated. And so these countries, I think he's regarded very highly because as the first Asian Director General of IRRI, he focused his attention, on Asia. The other big focus of his career throughout was the role of women in agriculture. He was a champion for gender sensitive policies. He brought gender into the agricultural curriculum in the universities in India. I think when he was in Erie, there were special programs on the role of women in rice farming in Asia. And then finally, when he was member of parliament, the Rajya Sabha, he brought in the private members bill on the empowerment of women in agriculture. But that bill, of course, did not, it did not see its way through the two houses of parliament. But he was able to influence several programs which specifically looked at the issues of women in agriculture and addressed them.
Now, earlier in our conversation, you mentioned about how he used to receive letters from farmers, right? So, we know that he was not only known for his scientific achievements, but he was a humanitarian. Can you share some anecdotes that would throw some light on that side of your father?
Yeah, many examples, but maybe one that comes to mind is when he was chairing the Farmers Commission. He was asked by the government of India, and over 6 years, between between 2000 and 2006, they produced 5 or 6 volumes of the Farmers Commission report in detail, really laying out what the future of the Indian strategy for agriculture and farmers' welfare should be. And he put the farmer at the center of the report. Unlike most people who might have focused on agriculture, he focused on the farmer and farmers' welfare. And at that time, there were a lot of suicides happening in Vidarbha that was getting a lot of attention. These were farmers who were losing money to money lenders. And because of crop failure, because of failed rainfall, they could not return their loans, and so desperate that they were taking their lives, leaving, of course, their wives and children behind. And he went and with some groups that were working there, NGOs, visited many of these houses where farmers had committed suicide. And he also visited people who were working in that region to understand what their problems were. He was extremely moved and distressed by what he saw. And so he was never one to only describe the problem. He always had a solution for every problem that he saw. I think that was, again, a very unique thing about him. And so whatever he could do, so after when MS Swaminathan Research Foundation was set up, he had a special program for the women farmers of Vidarbha, because of course many of them had then become the head of the household. And not only attention to their needs, but also to their children's needs of education and so on. But I think a lot of what he did, he listened to farmers from all over India, many stakeholders, as he was preparing this Farmers Commission report. He always had a soft corner for the weakest and most vulnerable in society, and he attributed that to the influence of Gandhiji in his life.
Yeah, I read how he was influenced in his early years by the Gandhian movement, and in fact, I think he also played a small role at one of the societies that Gandhi had started for the purpose of promoting food and agriculture. I'm sorry, I don't recall the name, but I just read that, and so on a personal side. I heard that he loved to play the veena, and he was a lover of music. But any personal hobbies or other interests that he enjoyed?
Well, he was a keen sportsman when he was younger. So he played both tennis and cricket. In fact, he continued playing cricket even after he was a scientist. And so I remember going for cricket matches in the Pusa Institute, students versus staff, faculty, and things like that. He loved music and drama and movies. But what I remember from my childhood is that he never had time for all of that. And so it was always my mother who would take us out to these cultural events. And rarely he would join us. quite rare. He loved Carnatic music, and after he moved to Chennai, after his retirement and all that, he became very close to MS Subbulakshmi, and they were very fond of each other. And many of his favorite songs are sung by MS Subbulakshmi. And other than that, I mean, I think he loved to travel because he just loved meeting people of all kinds and backgrounds. And he tried to take us with him whenever he could on his travels. So we saw large parts of India thanks to that. And he would always bring back something from his foreign travels, because in those days it was very rare for people to travel abroad, but he went often for meetings, scientific conferences. And so as children, I remember we would look forward to his coming back, because he would bring back something that was really representative of the country that he had gone to. So that also opened our eyes to the world as children.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I'm in Pittsburgh, so one of the earliest concerts of MS Subbulakshmi happened here at the Carnegie Hall. So thank you actually for sharing that. Now, what was your father's vision for India's future in the field of food sustainability and agriculture, and how do you and the research foundation are looking to ensure that that would be implemented or that would come true?
So when he set up the foundation, his motto was that the work that's done there should be pro-poor, pro-woman, and pro-nature. So essentially, he talked about, ecological security, economic and social security. And so that's been the theme. And the other thing he recognized, and he was one of the first people to talk about climate change and its impact on people, on their health and their nutrition, and why agriculture needs to really start, doing some anticipatory research to address the challenges that we're going to have. And so he looked at coastal systems, for example, since the foundation was set up in Chennai, which is a coastal city, and the role of mangroves that had been badly degraded over the years, and how mangroves could actually protect the coast from things like tsunami and cyclones, but also provide livelihood opportunities to the very poor people who live along the coast. And so he always married, I think, the two, sustainability in terms of ecological protection, bringing in new tools so that agriculture could also be sustainable, but also provide an economic return, and diversifying the livelihood opportunities on farm, off farm, and non-farm activities, as he liked to put them. Recently, I visited a few villages in Pondicherry or Puducherry, which is an area where he worked in the early 90s, bringing digital tools. At that time, there were no mobile phones. There weren't even computers. And so he used satellite technology to bring information to these villages. And the people there still remember how that transformed their lives. As we know today, we get everything, on our mobile phone. But in those days, many people were being exploited because they did not have access to the right information. And so just having a computer and having a couple of people to operate that computer center and provide the information that the farmer needed or the fisherman needed at the right time, made a big difference to their lives. And particularly the women there remember that he and my mother encouraged women basically to come out of their homes, get together, form self-help groups, and take up activities that would give them some economic independence so that they were not dependent, only on the husbands. So I think that was his vision, and it continued throughout his life. I mean, he worked in many different areas. He contributed a lot to the biodiversity laws that were set up in India, and also to the Plant Protection and Farmers' Rights Act, where he again brought in the principles of equity and social justice and said it's the small farmer, the tribals, who are actually conserving and preserving our land races and our indigenous varieties of crops. And so they should be the ones who benefit, from any commercial exploitation of those particular traits that these indigenous land races might have. And thanks to him, a lot of tribal people around country got recognized. Even global awards they won for having contributed to those kind of, agricultural heritage systems. So I think that's the philosophy, and so we will strive to take forward that. Of course, things keep changing, and we have to adapt. But I think the climate crisis has become even more acute. There's no time to lose, and not just farmers, but people all over the country and the world will need to adapt to the changing circumstances. We still have to feed the population of the world, which is still growing, but at the same time, we need to make sure that the planet that we live in, remains a habitable planet, and that we don't use up all the resources. So we are focusing on agriculture, nutrition, and health in the context of climate change, and making sure again that the most vulnerable, that their needs are addressed first.
Thank you. Yeah, it is indeed a sad situation, the whole climate change thing, and kind of the carelessness of most of the governments, but organizations like yours, gives humanity the hope that there are things to actually look forward to. So thank you. Now, as we wrap up, from your perspective, what advice do you think your father would want to impart on future generations, particularly those interested in science, agriculture, and sustainable development?
So I think that he would like people to be very open to science and technology. He always embraced and stayed up to date with the latest science, even till almost the very end. He would read Science and Nature and all the journals he subscribed to know what the latest was. So his curiosity remained till the end. So I think that's definitely a message he would like to give young people. But he also always said, don't become a slave to technology. Technology should be used as a tool to solve a problem. And maybe the problem can be solved without the latest technology. Maybe the solution is actually much simpler. So he always said, don't just blindly follow the latest and think that that's always the best, but use your judgment and then use technology as you see fit, and also to benefit people who otherwise get left behind during development. So I think that's the kind of advice that he would probably give to young people that are starting out in science. And we talked about science and society. How can we use science to benefit society?
And my apologies that I couldn't recall his association with Mahatma Gandhi earlier, but it just came back to me that he was part of the Gandhigram Rural Institute.
Yes.
So anyway, about again, right? If you were to write a book on your father's legacy, how would you name it? I'll tell you why I'm asking this. For example, Alexander Graham Bell, right? The first book on him is named "The Man Who Contracted Space," and so on. And so similarly, how would you write about your father? How would you name the book?
I mean, I think you could call it, The Man Who Fed India, and that would be quite accurate to do that. But I think, he was much more than just that, even though he's remembered mostly for the Green Revolution. And I think I would, I can't think of a very catchy title, but something like, a scientist who believed in, humanity, or scientist with a lot of compassion.
Okay.
And he was always very true to his belief, right? Till throughout his life, he did not compromise in his values. So I think it would be difficult to find a nice title to completely describe his personality. There could be many, I think, aspects of his life that could form the title of the book.
Right. I was actually thinking about this, and if I may, I'll just share. I don't have a title or anything, but I thought it was interesting because, the very famous words of Mahakavi Bharati, Tani Manidan Oruvanukku, right? And
Yes.
it's And if Bharati were alive, during those times, right, I'm sure he would have been so proud of Dr. Swaminathan, because I felt like, Dr. Swaminathan just, implemented what Mahakavi Bharati envisioned. I kind of felt that way. It was a very for me personally, again, right, hunger. It's such a cruel uh, condition. It's a terrible thing that one shouldn't experience. So, all I can say is, on behalf of humanity, thank you to your father for, ensuring that people had food on their plates. So just a few more questions. These are thematic questions that we ask all our guests. So if you could inject one dose of scientific curiosity into every person, what would that be?
You just observe a phenomenon in nature that happens every day around you. We take things for granted and try to understand what's actually going on, inside that leaf, inside that root.
Thank you. Yeah, we often fail to do that, right? We wonder at really complex things, but there are really, some really simple phenomena that we just overlook, and we don't take a deeper look into them.
Nature is so amazing. Yeah. Just trying to figure out how these things function and what kind of instincts that birds and animals have, and the way they look after their young, and the way the young actually learn to, for example, migrate. The young birds, how do they learn that they have to migrate in a particular route, and they do exactly what their parents, others did. So a lot of phenomena in nature which are fascinating. Just start asking questions, could go on.
It's interesting you said that, because I was talking to someone who had something very interesting to say on that topic. How we humans, we always say, we have that extra ability to communicate, to speak. But he had a different take on it. He said, well, isn't it amazing that they don't have to speak to communicate?
Yes, exactly.
So, anyway, I thought I'd share that. But,
yeah.
Can you recommend one book for our listeners, preferably related to science or nonfiction?
So I've been reading bits of many books recently, but there are two that stand out. One is called Pulse to Planet. That's by Professor Srinath Reddy, and it's a very interesting book that really looks at an individual cell. It starts with how the human body functions, and then goes on really to look at planetary health and how we are just one species that's living in this world. It takes a futuristic view, and it's basically written for young people. And the other one is also by an Indian author, Ashok Alexander, and it's called Let the Light In. Ashok, of course, used to head the Gates Foundation HIV prevention program in India, the Avahan program, but then later on set up a foundation that works on health of mothers and children in some of the poorest districts of central India. And so the book is very compelling. It also gives us an insight into, the lives of these very poor and very vulnerable communities, and how government programs actually can make a big difference in their lives if they're done, with humility, with compassion, actually talking and learning from these people rather than doing top-down kind of approaches. So those are two books, both related to health, but beautifully written and of course based on solid science and evidence.
Thank you. And like I said at the beginning of this call, right, the theme of these interviews or podcast episodes, it's about bridging humanity and science, especially coming from the history of science. So what is your favorite moment in the history of science?
I think it would have to be the discovery of vaccines or vaccinology, perhaps, and the famous experiment of Edward Jenner, with the cowpox, the observation that cowpox actually protected milkmaids from getting smallpox. And then he actually went ahead and injected a young 7-year-old boy, with the extract from one of the blisters from cowpox. And then the boy was exposed to smallpox, but he was protected. In those days, of course, smallpox was the biggest killer, I guess, of human beings. highly contagious. And the fact that, we've been able to eradicate smallpox. It started with Edward Jenner, but then, of course, it took, more than a century and the WHO and a massive global program. But it gave us confidence that we could eradicate a disease which maimed and killed millions of people, particularly in India. It was very common to see people with a lot of pock marks or who had gone blind because of smallpox, which they got. And so we're very close to polio eradication now. I mean, we're still not exactly there, but there is, I think, a good chance that we will achieve it. And all of this is thanks to vaccines. So I think that's been one of the biggest discoveries of modern science.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for taking time this evening to talk to us. And, I wish you all the very best with your work with the foundation. And, hope to talk to you sometime again in the future. And hopefully that time we could talk about your work.
Right. Definitely. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.